So today we're going to talk about far-right organizing and our role in opposing it as Marxists. Um, we'll walk through a high-level description of class analysis and why it's relevant, examine some of the features of fascism, and finally discuss how to fight it both in the general and specific to our situation here in Denver. Let's do a quick and dirty recap of how we analyze history. Before agriculture, people hunted and gathered what they could to survive, but with farming, we started to make more than we consumed. As this surplus emerged, societies grew around them to protect these surpluses. The protection of the surplus was eventually made independent of the community which produced the surplus. This is where the state comes from, and each state arises and is changed by the relationships that produce that surplus. This was true under kings and emperors whose surplus relied on peasants and serfs, just as it's true under capitalist investors whose surplus relies on the working class. The difference today is that where peasants and serfs were atomized and created that surplus value relatively independent of one another, of other groups of peasants rather, workers under capitalism are driven together and placed in a struggle against investors. Investors don't work for a living, they own for a living, and that gives them incentive to force wages down and hours up. The struggle for higher wages and more free time orients all wage workers as an entire class to oppose the investors. Since capitalism relies on wage workers to produce the vast majority of its society, workers organizing ourselves holds the key to effectively overthrowing the capitalist system. The exception to this dynamic would be what some call the middle class, small business owners, stockholders that draw part but not all of their income from capital gains, and people who are self-employed. Communists might call these folks petty investors or the petty bourgeoisie. While these folks don't share the same class interests as the monopoly capitalists, they also don't have the same universal incentive to struggle against the investors as the working class. The reason I place focus on class analysis while kicking off a talk about opposing the far right and fascism is that they are best understood as class phenomena. Its base of popularity, its historical role, where its violence is directed, how it relates to the state and why it needs to be confronted, and most importantly, how to effectively combat it are all questions best answered with class analysis. It might also be said that class analysis provides the only answer to those questions. A large reason fascism is so vastly misunderstood and ill-defined is because of liberalism's inability to understand or account for it. The dominant ideas of the ruling are the ideas of the ruling class, and so that confusion is diffused in media and academia until it's ubiquitous. Instead, Marxists sharply analyze the relationships present. So that begs the question, what are those relationships? A universal feature of fascism is capitalist social relations. Fascism is not a universal feature of capitalism, however. It occurs in a specific situation when the state's traditional apparatus failed to maintain the capitalist structures that empower the investing class and suppress the working class. This failure by the capitalist state, combined with a breakdown of previous social order, creates a mass base for fascism. People who were previously middle class that are now forced into the same position as workers. The petty investors who used to buy in wholeheartedly to all the investor propaganda and ideology are just abruptly forced to face the harsh reality of life as a wage worker as monopoly capital consolidates itself and they are increasingly impoverished. This is why we see such strong worker-friendly propaganda in fascism. The problems of capitalism are what the fascists hold up as their reasoning to abandon faith in the traditional state and cultural structures that prop up the capitalist class. The real anxiety about economic circumstances and the unavoidable fact that the state can't solve those issues are manipulated along with demagoguery against any group that the fascists can conveniently target. That's why they focus on impoverished minorities, people facing repression for sexual or religious practices, and most of all, groups existing with a diaspora or with a national identity to vilify, but no state to target. We often see fascism rise just after we've seen a previously high level of activity among socialists and communists ramping down. The failure of worker organizing to challenge capitalism, often due to a lack of independence from the investor state, while symptoms of economic exploitation push workers towards struggle, generates disillusionment, which can foster a mass base for fascists that take advantage, even among the working class. While skepticism and hostility towards the traditional investor state are hallmarks of fascism, the same is not true of their relationship towards their nation. This contradiction is often resolved by imposing a retroactive ideology on the nation in the past, from pining for return to the Confederacy, which lasted for a handful of years, to 1950s nostalgia. Fascists will insist that they're only trying to restore the natural order or former glory of their nation by violent force. That's another inherent attribute of a growing fascist movement, the use of violence and force to further their political goals. While it's obvious to say that fascism involves acts of terror, not all political violence is fascism. The investor's democracy uses political violence and terror against workers worldwide. This violence deserves opposition and analysis even without a connection to fascism. The mass nationalistic character of fascist rallies and pogroms is what defines them, not the violence itself. The burning of books is every bit as much of a fascist event as a lynching, and indeed one often leads to the other. Fascism also has distinct characteristics when it comes into power as well. For instance, as it gains political relevance, certain parts of the investing class begin to support it. As it's a reaction to and not a solution for capitalism's ills, the new fascist regime is seen as an acceptable alternative to the investor state. While it might not be the ideological preference for the investing class as a whole, it serves the all-important purpose of keeping the working class in a position to be exploited. It's especially welcomed by the section of the investing class that understands the imminent looming threat of working class revolution. They are desperate to stop it. Fascists in power also require violence. They've vilified and dehumanized scapegoats for so long that now the ritual slaughter is mandatory. We all know the worst examples of this, but in addition to Auschwitz and other concentration camps in Germany, we can see the White Terror in Spain under Franco, the football stadiums filled with leftists under Pinochet, and others. This violence is also used to dispose of whatever rights or freedoms had traditionally been protected by the liberal capitalist state. The press, assemblies, artistic expressions, and other rights, which only exist when defended en masse, are no longer permissible, often or possible, without dire, often deadly consequences. The state produced by fascism, born of blood and violence and reflecting the same, is not a tenable state. Its very nature puts it in opposition with the other states and institutions built to reinforce the ruling class's hegemonic domination. It cannot provide what it promises, an end to the problems caused by capitalism. And so its support changes from a mass character to one of statist bureaucracy. Long-term viability isn't important to fascism's historical objective, however. By the time it finally fails, its purpose is already served. Worker movements have been suppressed and working class revolution is staved off by a generation. So we can see the defining characteristics of fascism, but what does that tell us about our tactics and approach to opposing it? One thing we can see is that ignoring them doesn't disempower fascists. It doesn't drain their audience or sap their ability to project their politics. This old canard is born of a liberal misunderstanding of fascism, one that disempowers us by mystifying the origins and motivators of fascism. Confronting fascists, however, particularly in their nascent forms, has proven an historically effective deterrent. Fascism gains power as its mass base grows, particularly when and where it can win over sections of the working class. So when they hold rallies and try to capture the rising steam of class conflict in society, we must be there to not only spoil their plans to capture that steam, but for us to capture it in their stead. We also can't rely on the state to confront the growing menace of fascism. Despite the threat it will pose if left alone, the contradictions of the state prevent it from taking real substantive action. The ideological veneer of state neutrality, alongside its defining purpose of defending property rights, creates a system designed to protect the fascists, not to fight them. Additionally, the main arm of the state, its purveyor of violence, the police, also have strong ties, both in class composition and ideologically, to the growing fascist movement. Working class organization independent of the capitalist state is the only historically sound solution to the encroachment of fascism. Self-defense, not on the scale of an individual defending themselves from a single assailant, but on the scale of an entire social class defending itself from a cancerous tumor, is how fascism has been defeated in the past. What this looks like differs greatly, however, depending on the development of the fascist movement. It can be anything from a rally that drives away potential mobs of nationalists to a guerrilla war against a fascist regime already in power. But the defining characteristic is that it is organized by the communities that the fascists seek to oppress. So, how can we best get masses of workers organizing against fascism independent of the state and the investing class? Some political analyses say that social democracy is just a veneer of social fascism and that we should eschew any organization with non revolutionaries. But this isolates and disempowers revolutionaries in the movement against fascism. How else are we to win non revolutionaries to revolutionary politics if not by demonstrating their superiority in the struggle? Another answer is to join with these reformists and follow their lead on how to oppose fascists while trying to win them to our politics. While this certainly puts us in contact with other workers that we want to win, it affords no opportunity to actually win them over to our politics. As Marxists, we know it's not just a battle of ideas, but a battle of praxis, the synthesis of ideas and action that will win people over. A battle you can't fight if you're only trailing after reformists opportunistically. Instead, Marxists find an active front to fight on. And then we work on that front alongside other workers, making the case for our politics in both word and deed. This keeps our contact with fellow workers in the struggle that we need help organizing from, while limiting the ability of the NGO complex, the Democratic Party, the state, and other liberal organizations to interfere with real working class struggle. They'll certainly show up and do their best at co-opting once we're successful, but those are the very moments we'll be able to win workers by directly contrasting their ineffectual approach with our successful ones. We call this tactic the united front and contrast it to the ultra-left analysis of social fascism and the opportunistic tactic of the popular front, as outlined previously. The final safeguard we should take against fascism is to curtail their appealing to the working class by not disillusioning the working class in the first place. We see success when we see successes, we have to avoid any capitulation to the dominant capitalist logic. If Syriza hadn't caved into neoliberal pressure and agreed to the debt settled on them, Golden Dawn wouldn't have seen the surge it did in popular, though not parliamentary, support. Podemos in Spain is perhaps the more relevant example. After forming a coalition government in 2016 and completely failing to make any meaningful response to capitalism's ills, even participating in the violent suppression of Catalans demonstrating for independence, so it's no coincidence that Vox, a far-right nationalist party with members connected to previous Nazi formations, has risen in popularity. As of 2019, it's the third largest political party in Spain. In France, the Yellow Jackets protests produced tangible results and reforms, but organizational cohesion failed to materialize. And in its wake, Marine Le Pen and the National Front's popularity has increased. Here in the US, the socialist left is a long way from coming to real power, but people carrying the banner of socialism, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, failing to provide real solutions to the working class problems their careers rely on, is a formula for generating mass support for fascism in the United States. The solution isn't for these figures to give up or for their supporters to descend into nihilism. Rather, the solution would be to stop following the lead of the capitalist parties and to refuse to capitulate on military and domestic budgets dripping with blood. Likewise, we're not encouraging supporters of reformism to give up on organizing, but rather to organize independently of the capitalist class who have complete control of the state, including both political parties. The only thing that capitalist parties can offer is disillusionment leading to apathy and disconnection with intentional struggle or outrage that the fascists seek to appeal to as much as we do. So that brings us to our specific and current situation. How does this information form our own approach to confronting the right wing and organizing the working class in general? We can already see many of the features of fascism on the rise, with finance capital consolidating itself faster and more efficiently than ever. The base of middle-class folks forced into the proletarian life is obviously there. COVID has greatly expanded this demographic. While this virus has sharply affected the working class the most, it's also created a flash flood of those middle-class folks forced into proletarian class relations. We see the usual outsiders, black folks, communists, Jews, targeted by an increasingly emboldened pool of nationalist militias and gangs, another sign of creeping fascism. We've seen repeated failures of people stuck with the label socialist. Of course, Obama wasn't an actual socialist and Sanders remains a senator, but that doesn't stop the disillusionment from folks who've heard the propaganda to address actual working class problems. Of course, there's also Donald Trump's hostility to the state. Not only has he subverted the traditional rule of law by breaking it with the impunity his political connections provide, he's also continuously railed against the deep state and establishment politicians. He targets immigrants as political whipping boys for all social ills and wraps his entire odious nationalistic propaganda up in his campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." So does that make Donald Trump a fascist? Did Biden's inauguration save us from Trump's fascism? In a word, no. Trump may be an aspirational fascist and might be influenced by fascism or find it appealing, but he still exists very much within the traditional capitalist state. We've seen other presidents have foreign ties, break laws with politically protected impunity, target immigrants, and utilize right wing nationalism before, and we will again. This is well inside the acceptable bounds of the investing class's state. Certainly, Trump breaks with standard neoliberal policy, and that has many investors, particularly the ones invested in MSNBC and CNN, up in arms. But internal conflicts between investors in the class is a regular feature of capitalism, although at this stage it more often takes the form of inter-imperial rivalries between national blocs. That doesn't mean that we don't need to oppose fascism now while it's still nascent, however, or that we should limit ourselves to the opposition of fascism and not also right-wing bourgeois activity. Indeed, the opposite is true. By organizing now before fascism has made a real foothold, we're able to utilize tools that would be unavailable to us under fascism to stymie the growth and the power of fascist elements. For instance, under fascism, we wouldn't be able to assemble in the park to oppose those militias. The result would be our violent slaughter. Right now, we're able to organize a mass of people that can drive away a fascist rally without firing a shot, as we did on the Saturday pictured here. We would also not be able to organize facing the public. It would pose too great a danger. In our current circumstances, however, the bourgeois state isn't focused on repressing our public organizing. The repression that does occur, both via riot cops attacking protests and vigilantes targeting people involved in the uprisings, can best be combated with numbers. The same is true for capitalism in general. We need a mass base of workers to be organized and coordinated to take hold of the productive forces currently used for their exploitation. Obviously, a couple dozen communists in one organization is not going to do it. Many small organizations have made the drastic mistake of overestimating their influence over struggles that they were involved in. Instead, the Denver communists to clarify our political questions among ourselves, to build our numbers by projecting Marxist politics and the struggles that we're relating to. We don't just seek to grow our size, but rather we seek to grow and develop trained Marxists to help build working class power with us. The Denver communists apply the United Front tactic by identifying specific events, making calls or demands that we'd like to support, and building for our presence there. Let's take the event pictured here and previously as an example. When John Teagan called the militia muster, we knew that workers close to us politically would be active in imposing it. Whether or not we were involved, there was going to be a rally to oppose the fascists. We also knew that we could make this event better and demonstrate the efficacy of Marxist politics by being involved. We had an amazingly successful tabling where we made contacts and distributed books with our politics. Internally, after that event, we won over 3 people to membership who had previously been in our periphery for some time. Our process of openly organizing events facing the public and crafting statements as a group has clearly had a sharpening effect on our own political abilities, as well as a draw for others who want to get involved in Marxist organizing. So with that, I look forward to the discussion as well as organizing with all of you in the coming weeks. If you're new here, I hope you'll stick around, get a sense of our politics, and maybe dip a toe in working with us on actions. And if you've been around, there's never been a better time to join up and make your membership official. Thanks.